Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. Today, my name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies and also the director of Berkeley's Dutch Studies program, and together we organize today's event. Today, as you all know, is a very sad day for all of us, especially for people in Europe, when we see those terrible images from the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. And what I can say is that we are planning a rapid response event in response to what is happening in the Ukraine. We'll do that on Monday. And of course, while our thoughts today are with the people in the Ukraine, we still want to continue with our program, with the event that we have scheduled for today. It's an event that we organize in cooperation with our colleagues from the Department of Architecture here in Berkeley, as well as with Flanders in the USA, which is the representation of the region of Flanders in Belgium to the United States. Flanders in the USA has been a very important ally for us here at Berkeley, for the Dutch Studies program, for the Institute of European Studies as well. Let me perhaps give you a little bit of background on this event that takes place in connection to the PP Rubens Chair, because today's speaker represents the Rubens Chair on the Berkeley campus this year. So what is the Rubens Chair? It's a rotating visiting professorship at UC Berkeley that is sponsored by the government of the region of Flanders in Belgium. And it allows us to annually bring a visiting professor from a Flemish university to Berkeley to teach a course on the Berkeley campus and to also give a public lecture that relates to Flanders. Allow me to briefly also use this opportunity to thank my predecessor, Emeritus Professor Johan Snapper, who created this visiting professorship in the 1980s. Also to my colleague in the Department of History, Professor Jan de Vries, who over the years has been a very strong ally in support of the Rubens Chair, and also to two colleagues in Europe, Professor Walter Prevenier from Ghent University and Koenraad van Kleinpoel from Hasselt University, for being the representatives of this Rubens Chair in Flanders, Belgium. Let me then welcome this year's Peter Paul Rubens visiting professor, Nikolaas Vande Keere, who is an associate professor at the School of Architecture and Arts at Hasselt University in Flanders, Belgium. Professor Vande Keere coordinates the International Master of Architecture on Adaptive Reuse, and he's also a member of the research unit Trace, Heritage and Adaptive Reuse. His main interests are research by design, theory, and history in the field of adaptive reuse, with a focus on ecclesiastical architecture as well as contentious heritage. Professor Vande Keere prepared for us today a presentation that will take about 35-40 minutes. It will be followed by a Q&A. And so during his presentation, all of you are invited to post your own questions in the chat, and I will be happy to pass on a selection of those questions to Professor Vande Keere during our Q&A session. But now, please relax and please join me in welcoming Professor Nikolaas Vande Keere.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Special good evening, I guess, to my colleagues in Belgium. I will try to address this topic somehow focusing on the topic, because indeed it's very difficult with the elephant in the room, as Jeroen also mentioned. My lecture is about contentious heritage. And I'm glad that actually Jeroen already gave an introduction on exactly what my position is, so I don't have to do that anymore. Yeah, okay. Well, this is actually a starting point which is recognizable to many people here. And in a way, actually, to many people all over the world, this is a Google search in October 28th of last year of the term General E. Lee. And I guess I don't have to mention that much about it in this context, but General E. Lee for the Europeans was the general of the Confederate Army during the Civil War in the United States. And obviously it is about the discussion on contemporary iconoclasm that my lecture will be working further. So there is a relationship between different places in the world actually addressing these issues. I started this little research, so to speak, which is part of a larger research on contentious heritage, with this article by a colleague, again, also here, a professor in Berkeley, Adam Hochschild, professor of journalism. And he wrote this article, Midnight in the Statue Storage Vault in the San Francisco Chronicle. It's a small article, but what is interesting about the article, I think, is it mentions a couple of names. It addresses a couple of personalities that are somehow in a kind of fictive conversation with each other. And all of these characters are having a kind of a contentious background. So as I mentioned, Robert E. Lee is obviously the first one. Stonewall Jackson has also been active in the Confederate Army. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Cecil Rhodes, South Africa, was a proponent of apartheid. He lends his name to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. British colonialist also. Edward Colston, going back to the 17th and 18th century, English parliamentarian, slave trader. Junipero Serra, probably more known here than in Europe, was a missionary known for abuse of indigenous population in California. Christopher Columbus, well, we all know that one. Frank Rizzo was a police officer and mayor of Philadelphia, responsible for police brutality and was an opponent of desegregation. Joseph Stalin, I don't need to explain that. King Leopold II, which is actually the main character, I guess, reappearing in this lecture. Queen Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI are a couple. And Woodrow Wilson, famous president of during World War I, academic, but in favor of segregation politics. Okay, briefly about the Robert E. Lee Monument I'm going to talk about is the one in Richmond, Virginia, recently removed, as probably most of you know, and is part of a list of monuments, and in this case, actually, part of a list of monuments along the Richmond Avenue, the historic line in the town of Richmond, the capital of Virginia, and also the capital of the Confederacy back in the days. There are many monuments there, as you can see. The red ones are being removed, or have been removed, and the Robert E. Lee one is very recently removed as, let's say, the icing on the cake of all of this. What is interesting about this map, I think, is that it's not just about the monuments, but this is actually also a marker of a kind of supremacist neighborhood, if you like, a white residential neighborhood that was segregated from the black part of the city. So, as I mentioned, in September 8th, the statue was removed. This is a picture of the Sokol. They're also, I think by now this is also removed. It kind of shows let's say, the popular feeling in the US, which is remarkable, I think, for many Europeans, is the fact that the statues are effectively being removed. To quote, in this case, the Society of Architectural Historians, not an unimportant organization, Confederate monuments do not serve as catalysts for cleansing public conversation. Rather, they express white supremacy and dominance, causing discomfort and distress to African American citizens who utilize public spaces occupied by these monuments. Our inaction gives these monuments power. By leaving them in place, we allow the dead hand of the past to direct some Americans away from that which belongs to all of us. History has proven that progress is possible, but also that the persistent racial schism in our society will not be conquered without radical, sustained action. The removal of Confederate monuments is a necessary and important step in this process, and one that cannot wait any longer. Well, we say that over this part of the world, but actually it's not happening in Europe. So if I take another case, the case, of course, that is very known in my country, the Leopold II monument in Brussels, it's still standing. Maybe there's a lot of discussion about it, but it's still there. And it's quite clear there's a big difference, in other words, culturally speaking, and how to deal with these monuments. Of course, Leopold II is known for the atrocities in the Congo. Most of you know that probably. And again, Adam Hochschild, it has to be, again, somebody from outside of our country that kind of pulls the alarm bell. Adam Hochschild wrote this book in '98, King Leopold's Ghost, denouncing obviously the atrocities and the casualties of the red rubber system in the Congo. If you look closely at the image, you see that in the back, there's actually part of some black people, some black laborers with their hands severed. So this it's quite clear Leopold II was actually, well, let's say, comparable to some of these names that I already mentioned. Interestingly, Leopold II actually used the funds, profits he got from the Congo to finance a large amount of nation-building projects in Belgium. So in a way, you could even say that Belgian identity owes something to this king, second king. So in other words, more problematic than it seems, of course. And this is, for instance, an image in Ostend, where you see here on the left, the black person who used to be a slave, and the hand is actually cut off in 2004, which is like a fitting, let's say, answer to this monument to a certain degree, referring to the hand severed during the colonial regime. Okay, what I actually want to do, this was an introduction, so to speak, comparison between US and Belgium. In this lecture, I would actually like to address the underlying aspects of this. So rather than looking at a political discussion or an ideological discussion on the meaning of these statues as such, I would actually like to focus on the spatial and the materialistic context that comes with it. So, and it seems, because we're kind of staring in the headlights of a heated discussion today. And in order to get a bit more clarity, I guess it's good to look behind that. So it seems like simple and straightforward to define these three strategies in the case of public statues and monuments. Everybody would somehow come up with these, but somehow if you look further, if you look below the water surface, let's say, there's more going on if you look to the museological context, which is also about public space, and then later on in the architectural context. Now, these terms, they actually also apply to a certain degree in another context, and but they change meaning slightly, and they give an idea of what actually it means. There's some kind of interesting interconnections appearing, but I will repeat myself later on. I will work this out. So let's first start with the public statues and the monuments, clarifying these three strategies. It's quite easy in a way. The first is preservation. What happens with preservation? Another example of a Leopold II monument in Belgium. This is actually in the town of my university, Hasselt. What happened here is they simply added a small caption here to explain the monument as such. So preservation is being argued here as something based on the principle the past should not be erased. National monuments, they're established as protected or listed heritage by governmental decree. So this is something recognizable all over in all the countries of the world. So there's just a small addition to clarify the true situation of the depicted historical figures. This is, let's say, a conservative approach, you could say. Strategy 2, adaptation. I'm showing you here an example of, again, a Confederate general, Jeb Stuart, and the sculpture that replaces it at the moment, called Rumors of War by the artist Kehinde Wiley. In 2019, you can clearly see what happened. The equestrian concept was kept. There's a lot of equestrian statues in this presentation. The equestrian concept was kept, but they added, they transformed, they replaced the original general by kind of a proud black person looking back almost in the same posture as the original. Here, preservation becomes also an issue. But you could say there's an emphasis on historical layers of the sculpture. Addition or removal of a layer is then the methodology to adapt the original image, but at least keep it partly preserved. It denounces through a very visible counterbalance, ranging from a spatial adjustment or the setting of the placement to the placement of a counter image to an intervention on the image itself. As in this example. Removal. We all know removal. What is interesting about removal is that it comes closest to the literal toppling of a statue by a revolutionary crowd, let's say. This is not the case in most of the cases here. For instance, in this example, as you can see, it's actually it's organized. It's something, a crane comes in, takes away the statue. So this is actually not bottom up as much as it seems. It garners a symbolic or spiritual value by elevating it to a ritual of cleansing and healing. A clear example here, the performance artist Setimbele Msezane is showing here the bird of Zimbabwe at the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue in Cape Town. What is also interesting is that these statues are usually not destroyed. They're degraded. They're placed in a secondary museum, a private park or depot. It's the imaginary storage vault that Hochschild was talking about. It's interesting to show because it kind of shows a degree of shame almost, if you like. I call it Museum B. And I was looking, it's like a note to this. I started investigating different places. Where do these statues end up? It's interesting to see that they end up in places that are somehow also qualified to a secondary level, if you like. And the word depot starts to become something else also. The word depot has a different meaning, as you will see later on also. It almost is like a metaphorical word. And in its capacity as storage space, it forms the ideal environment for the sculptures in suspension of meaning. This quote comes quite close to it. The German word museal has unpleasant overtones. It describes objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship and which are in the process of dying. Elder preservation more to historical respect, remaining residual historical respect, you could say, and to the needs of the present. Museum and mausoleum are connected by more than phonetic association. Museums are like the family sepulchres of works of art. They testify to the neutralization of culture. And I started looking for examples, as I mentioned, and one of the obvious ones is in Congo. This is actually of 70, the statue, the exact same statue of Leopold II in Place du Trône in Brussels was actually residing also on the Place du Trône in Kinshasa, so a mirroring situation, erected 2 years after the one in Brussels. But Mobutu, when Mobutu came to power in 65, 5 years later, actually removed the statues. And it ended up here in a kind of improvised open air museum. It is called Institut des Musées Nationaux du Congo, but that's far overrated, let's say. It's just a name, it's a typical Mobutu name, first the name, and then the museum. The museum actually never came. So it's interesting also to see how these photographs are made. The left images, for instance, of famous photographer Karl de Keyser in our country. Interesting, of course, it is cut out. It kind of shows the image almost aside, not head on. Another example, a recent example, a colleague of mine worked on it, Asli Sishek, an open air depot in Middelheim, which is actually designed, in other words. So you have a museum B here in a park, a museum park that is designed, but it's actually supposed to be a depot. And as you can see, the plan is kind of full of postmodern games, if you like. And you can see also in the pictures, it's, sorry, again, I'm trying to, horizontal images, horizontal statues, position that is one of the favorites, I guess, when a statue is toppled. You see this interaction between different statues here, things like that. And actually there was supposed to be a Leopold II statue there of a town nearby, Ekeren. It didn't happen because it was too well designed almost, you could say. It feels as if Museum B became Museum A, so maybe we shouldn't put it there. It's too good. And a third example, also an interesting one, Edward Colston, slave trader in UK in Bristol. This was actually literally toppling. This was a crowd. This was a bottom up, if you like. And it's interesting to see, obviously, again, putting horizontal in a kind of glass sarcophagus box, kind of grave, almost like a negative Cinderella. But added to it is a sign, if you read the thing in the back, asking the public, what should we do with this? Makes us think also of what Rodney Harrison called absent heritage, the way in which the absences of partially or fully destroyed objects are conserved actively or passively, for instance, by not rebuilding or replacing something which has been partially destroyed. The trope of the absent, mutilated or toppled statue or memorial has appeared with increasing frequency throughout the 20th century and into the early 21st as a metaphor for humiliated and overthrown political regime. Images of the acts of symbolic humiliation and mutilation of statues and buildings have often been staged or recorded, multiplying and circulating widely in the print, film, and later electronic media. He is actually referring to mostly communist regimes, but this is obviously continuing now in the 21st century. Okay, we go to the second level, museological context. Here I would actually like to focus on a case study, to use the case study, so to speak, to prove my point and to show how these, let's say, the different strategic approaches also apply to museum context. The museum has recently been renovated. So the original building is actually built under Leopold II by Charles Giraud, but was finished 1 year after the death of Leopold II. And on the right, you see some images of the recent renovation by Stefan Bill architects. I'm not going to go too much into the architectural project. I'm more interested in the museological aspects of the case. This is a painting of Sherry Samba. It's actually quite old already, if you like, of 2002. And it shows in a nutshell, so to speak, the issues that are at stake here. It shows the wrangling of the staff of the museum and the Congolese diaspora in Belgium with the objects in the museum, notably the leopard man, as I will show you later. This is the director, of the museum. He still is, by the way, Guido Grisels. So it kind of sums up very well some of the issues that had to be addressed. The museum is renovated. It has been a process, a hard and long process between 2013 and 2018. Obviously, because it's not just an architectural project, it's actually a project of, one could say, decolonization. Now, I'm going to focus on the collection and the way it's on display in the museum. I'm going to focus mainly on the older building, and some of the rooms here I will be addressing later on. I can tell you, actually, this was received with mixed feelings, to say the least. So, for instance, this is a quote of the United Nations. The working group of experts on people of African descent welcomes the recognition of the need to reform the museum and is of the view that the steps taken thus far to organize it and add new exhibits have not gone far enough. For those communities that engage in vibrant post-colonial discourse, including civil society, historians, and activists of African descent, this reorganization falls short of its goal, providing adequate context and critical analysis. The working group notes the importance of removing all colonial propaganda and are currently accurately presenting the atrocities of the colonial past of Belgium. So, according to the United Nations, it didn't go far enough. This has been mirrored in the press in general, you could say, and even somebody like Adam Hochschild also wrote a review. Nevertheless, I think there are some interesting examples, again, to try to understand how, methodologically speaking, we could deal with that. So if you take the original ones of public statues and monuments in a museological context, I would dare to say these are the main terms that are appearing. I should add here maybe replacement, but you will see later on what I mean. So again, showing you some examples of these three strategies. The first one is the sculpture depot. It's actually in the basement of the museum, and it's one of the first spaces you pass when you visit the museum today. It's also called, it's funny, in French it's called la poubelle, it's the garbage bin. So the French-speaking part of our country is more direct, you could say, about this. It collects some stereotypical colonial scenes, such as the leopard man. By the way, the leopard man, maybe some of you know from childhood, if you read Tintin, the leopard man is very present in Tintin in Africa. It is obviously a very controversial statue because it's a kind of misrepresents events of a kind of a small faction in Congolese society, that kind of a terrorist group punishing the Congolese people that were collaborating with the colonial power. So you see here where it was before and where it ends up there. It's kind of a collection. So you could say it's removed from its original place and it's placed somewhere else. So this could easily apply, strategy 3 could easily apply here. Note this statue here on the left, kind of Rodin-like statue. Interesting also, this is the one here you see by a sculptor called Herbert Ward, an English sculptor who was residing in Africa and a long time in Congo also. It's interesting to read. Part of his work is also on display in the Smithsonian in Washington, and the Smithsonian writes about it on these two sculptures. Sleeping Africa seems to support the then popular theory that the development of African cultures had been physically and culturally retarded. The allegorical figure of Africa is depicted asleep on the map of the continent. The implication here is that colonialism will awaken the continent to his true potential. A decade later, the one on the right is a decade later, however, Ward had begun to question the excesses of the colonial experiment, which were then coming to light in the press. In his last sculpture, The Stress or the Tragedy of the Congo, he represents the male figure in a classical posture of mourning. Interesting. It's clearly a gray zone we're talking about. What exactly, where should we position these works of art, they're interesting, but they're also tainted. They're also controversial. So how do we deal with that exactly? Herbert Ward was a friend of Roger Casement, for instance, who denounced the atrocities of the first report that came out, was commissioned by the British government, was written by Roger Casement, who was a friend of Herbert Ward. But note, Casement denounces the atrocities. He didn't denounce colonialism. Hence the gray zone. Okay, another example, the Rotunda. Maybe the most important space in the original building of the museum. So here you see an original image with a bust of Leopold II on the Star of the Congo Free State. And what happened is they removed this, obviously, and replaced it. But according to the Agency of Immovable Heritage, it could not be in the middle because the star had to remain. And also the allegorical figures in the space also had to remain. They were listed, protected, but obviously showing very much colonial rule, symbolizing colonial rule. So an artist, M.A. Mpan, made first this statue, but this was obviously not sufficing. It didn't really form a counterbalance to the space. So they kind of started working on it and they added another one. But also that it didn't really fulfill this kind of balance. So they added another one together with Jean-Pierre Muller called Restore. So they kind of tried to deal with these sculptures that had to be kept. So what happened here is they tried to hang in front of each of these a kind of a canvas with a print on it, somehow denouncing or forming a counterbalance to the original. In this case, for instance, an image of a snake with the head of Leopold II. It's actually a famous historical image during colonial rule. So as I mentioned, this is clearly an example of strategy 2 that is actually trying to define a counterbalance. Although I think it's a bit clumsy, it doesn't really fully work. The space, originally speaking, let's say the authentic space, is much too strong at the moment to fully deal with this. An example of strategy 1, restoration. I think a good example, Crocodile Room. What is interesting of the Crocodile Room is it's actually being restored, has been restored, reconstructed in its original condition. And what is mainly interesting, I think, here are these paintings above. So there are these things on display here. There are butterflies. Well, we all kind of know what kind of image the original museum would have had. But what is interesting is that these paintings are being kept and they show a kind of idyllic Congo that has not been touched. It has actually not even been colonized to a certain degree. But it's interesting to see how the lure, let's say, of colonialism in this room, the way colonialism addresses the romantic aspect of Congo and puts it on display. It's interesting to show that because people in the past, when they visited the museum, they obviously didn't have access to the current media, and they had to be guided. So this is actually the best room, I think, to show how people were misguided, if you like. It's interesting to keep and to understand the kind of intriguing aspects of colonialism. And as a last example in the museum, I think the most successful one, albeit very subtle and small, is the Remembrance Room. It's actually in a corridor that's not very present. And if you visit the museum, you run the risk of not having seen this, because it also needs sunlight. What happens here is that this is the top part are the names of the Belgian people that died during the Congo Free State. About 1,500 people died. Obviously, the original museum commemorates the Belgians, but it obviously also doesn't commemorate the African people that died during the period. So this artist, Freddy Tsimba, decided to depict 7 names, the people that died, the Congolese people that died in Belgium during the regime. He actually based on, there's a window in front of this and there are like stickers of letters on top of it. And when the sun shines, these letters are being projected on top and below this memorial. So there's an interesting, it's a very subtle, poetic gesture, if you like. And I think in as such, it actually doesn't try to, it doesn't use a kind of a powerful charge in the sense of scale or quantity. It's a very interesting poetic gesture. Okay, going to the last level, architectural context. I am using a quote that my colleagues in Belgium all know, almost by heart, I guess. It's a very interesting quote of a text, a seminal text in our research group of Rodolfo Machado. In the process of remodeling, however, the past takes on a greater significance because it itself is a material to be altered and reshaped. The past provides the already written, the marked canvas on which each successive remodeling will find its own place. Thus, the past becomes a package of sense, of built-up meaning to be accepted, maintained, transformed, or suppressed, refused. So, interesting, this kind of explains, again, these three strategies. In an architectural context, restoration with minimal additions, in the context of adaptation, adaptive reuse, and in the context of removal, dismantling, or destruction. Interesting to see, because on an architectural level, what was somehow a kind of polarized situation in the case of public statements, or we preserve it or we remove it, that's generally, let's say, what dominates the discussion. In architecture, the middle ground is actually much more present, also makes much more sense, because of obviously demolishing buildings is also has an economic impact. To give you some examples of this, it's quite easy to understand restoration. I think we all know that. For instance, the older African Museum is actually completely restored, although the extension is another issue. And an interesting example of destruction or dismantling relating back to Museum B is this one, the Afterlife of the Robin Hood Gardens. Maybe some of you know it. It's similar to the Pruitt-Igoe construction that has been demolished, declared by Charles Jenks as the end of modernism. This is, let's say, the European version of that, by Allison and Peter Smithson in London. Recently demolished, but too valuable somehow to completely demolish. So they kept the part. And this is on display here in the Venice Architectural Biennial. It's a part kept by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where actually don't only do it with this building, they're kind of collecting building parts all over the place, which is interesting. So it's an interesting example of strategy 3 in the case of architecture. But I would like to finish with two cases which are, let's say, closer to Belgium again, which are about a colonial encounter between Belgium on the one hand and Central Africa on the other hand. Two cases that have been researched by students of mine. Also interesting, one Belgian student and one student from Rwanda. So again, perfect mirror, if you like. And I'm showing you these two images. Site one is a postcard of the temporary African villages in Tervuren, actually close to the museum. The museum was actually built as a result of that. These were temporary human zoo, if you like, during the World Fair of 1897. Interesting to see. This is a postcard of the World Fair. So this is a souvenir, not of Africa, but Brussels Tervuren. And the second image shows again this confrontation between, in the foreground, the primitive settlements, if you like, within the back, the very modern European investment and the power of colonialism. The school I'm talking about, of course, the project of Roger Bastin in the back. So interesting here how primitive Africa, dark Africa is being imported in Belgium, but we as Europeans export modernism. Interesting. The first one. So actually these villages are positioned here. This is an old map of the World Fair of Tervuren. This is the Rotunda Park for some of you who know the place. This is the center of the village of Tervuren. And this is the place where the museum later on was then being constructed. As I said, as a result of this exhibition that was extremely successful. I'm talking about this building here, the horseshoe building here, which is actually called Panquin Kazarnes Barracks, built in the 18th century under Austrian rule. So, but that's a history apart, also interesting. But so what we see here is obviously the site in front of it. There's a kind of a pond here, and then you have these villages. And during the World Exhibition, this formed the perfect setting for African villages, if you like. So in Tervuren, it created an image far away from European cities that was it seemed at least very authentic. What was interesting is that the people that were brought here to inhabit these sites were actually from the army. They were not from these kind of primitive villages, if you like. And during the night, they didn't stay in the village here. They stayed in the Panquin barracks. They slept there. So this was clearly a very theatrical event. As a result of this, you saw the names being projected on the wall before. Actually, 7 people, 7 Congolese died of a simple pneumonia due to the Belgian climate. It was in August, strangely enough, and usually August is a better month in Belgium, but it was not the case here. So these people were buried first in unconsecrated ground even. So it's clear that this site has quite some history, although it's being ignored largely today. So here you see the building I was mentioning, and in front of it is the park. And the park is actually it's a nice 19th century park. Nothing really indicating this event, except for maybe one plate explaining what happened there. But for the rest, nobody actually notices this history. So the student picked that up, obviously, because it actually kind of makes clear how the African Museum is an island next to Tervuren, and Tervuren seems to be not wanting to do anything with it spatially. The village of Tervuren has not a lot of aspects referring to it. So this student tried to deal with that. He's actually from Tervuren. He was originally from Tervuren. So he actually used the idea of this space in between. If you look back here, you see that this is open. But during the World Exhibition, there was a kind of a winter garden, a canopy constructed there for an exhibition on agriculture. And he used this to create a center for African art, contemporary African art. Imagining and thinking of the position contemporary art plays in the African Museum, actually it's always in between collections there. It's never fully addressed in its own identity, if you like. So the idea behind this project was to kind of create a counterweight to define something that would define also a relationship with Tervuren, locally with this building, and actually extending this project to the park as a kind of a sculpture garden also. That was the idea behind it. The second project, I'm very brief about the project, is made by Emile Uwamungu, another student coming from Rwanda, as I mentioned. This is in Burundi. Well, I already showed you some images, and this is another one. It kind of shows a college in splendid isolation, designed by a Belgian architect, actually on the brink of almost independence. This is the site. It's close to Bujumbura, the capital of Burundi, and actually also close to the Lake of Tanganyika in East Africa, for some of you who know the region. This school was a propaganda project for the Belgian government, very much investing very much in it, obviously modernist, giving interracial education, maybe one of the first schools in Africa doing that. But obviously, and that we don't see that, but these children are of the elite. They're of the elite, the people who are governing, who are in charge, or who have economic power in the region. You see here, these images were really propaganda images. I have to say, we have to thank colleague Johan Laga from University of Kent, who studied this more in depth for allowing us to show these images. Some other examples of the architecture, you obviously here see the chapel in modernist style, tropical modernist style. And as you can see here on the left, Catholic values were very much at the core of this. So don't make a mistake, it is still very colonial. This is the current condition. The school is largely intact, but obviously the maintenance is a problem. The school also went through a lot of turmoil. For instance, in the 90s, when there was a conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi population, some students were actually died here also on the campus. So it witnessed quite a lot. And now it's currently owned by the University of Bujumbura, Burundi. But it's not really used to the full. But this student introduces an adaptive reuse project, mainly programmatic. On the one hand, a conference center. It's on the left part of this, let's say, and an agricultural incubator on the right. And the main impact, spatially speaking, is maybe not a coincidence. It's the same with the project. The previous project is very much on a landscape level, and the way this kind of enclosed, this fortress opened up to the environment. So he decided to open up the buildings on the bottom. You don't really see that here. What you do see is the interventions here in the gardens. For instance, these are testing fields. This used to be sports fields. Now it's kind of used as a test fields for the agricultural incubator. Okay, I'm not going to go in detail here. To finish up with one quote again, Africa was rid of the conquistador. Freedom and its boat had arrived. And out of the freedom boat, almost imperceptible, just behind, some would say hand in hand with freedom itself, stepped memory. The vengeful, unforgiving brigand of all time. It is the storyteller, Ashebe has said, who makes us what we are, who creates history. Storyteller creates the memory that survivors must have. Otherwise, their surviving would have no meaning. Memory heals, it regenerates, and it's an affirming God, a transcendent guide in the ritual of continuity. But when spurned, when repressed, memory mutates into a trickster imp and seduces the wayfarer to the precipice and beyond. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nikolaas. Excellent presentation on contentious heritage. And maybe I use the opportunity to start a discussion with a question that makes also a connection to today, because I don't think we should avoid it completely, right? And it came to my mind when you showed us the quotation from the Architectural Society, where it was mentioned that, you know, this progress and we're moving forward and we're moving away and we leave this behind us, so to speak. And then when we think of today and we see kind of a return of this imperialist way of thinking, also in the case of Africa, you know, it came to my mind when it mentioned Africa was rid of the conquistador, but then you think of the presence of China nowadays in Africa and in a kind of, you know, neo-colonial way almost, right? But taking all of that in consideration, my question to you is the following: when we speak of how to deal with contentious heritage, is there enough awareness that imperialism can always come back? That it's not necessarily something that is completely gone and of the past, but that there's also this risk, right? That one day it may return. Can you perhaps say something about that?
Well, it's a good question, because it's questions I'm trying to avoid, of course, to a certain degree, because I think as a researcher I tend to look for other things below the surface. But I also started to understand by doing the research that it's extremely important to do the research, all of us, not just one researcher or a scholar, but to understand better these places, because I actually also didn't fully know the meaning of all these places. So if I can answer your question, I think it's extremely important first to try to understand the places and our history, to argue about it. And indeed, it's very much, and this is actually a warning, but it's not strong enough today. This was a warning in the comfort of the beginning of the century, where I remember also under Obama, we all felt like we're okay. The world is okay. We're doing fine, except for some issues. This is obviously not the case. So, yeah, I think in research could contribute, albeit in a very modest way.
Thank you, Nikolaas. Let's open the floor for questions. Maybe a first question from the audience, and then we have a look and see if there's someone on Zoom who also has a question. Whom can I give the first quiz? First question.
It's a wonderful talk that I enjoyed a lot. It's so appropriate that it's here because you can see a building over there, about 40 yards away from us, what used to be the Kant Hall, is now the Science Hall, because it was renamed. Turns out, Kant was a slave owner and racist theorist. And 100 yards that way is Evans Hall, which is about to be destroyed completely.
And we're in Moses Hall, and the name will change.
Yeah. So this is around us everywhere. I guess one of the things that I was struck by was, in a way, how Belgium is coming to this a little late. When I was in Brussels in 2016, the museum there still has this huge portrait of Leopold II, and no little placard saying, "Oh yes, millions of people died while he was raping the country." And you have some wonderful examples here, but I kept thinking about how history is treated in Berlin, where they have already gone through a number of these different things, like the Air Force building, which they just slapped a new floor down so that you don't see the swastika in the center, and it's still there and still being used. But over on what used to be the Gestapo headquarters, they've retained the underground cells, but then created an entirely new museum, topography distilled. And they've got other buildings. I mean, there's nothing but construction in Berlin. But Belgium is now forced to look abroad, where Germany had to look at home because they had so much destruction and guilt to them. Do you care to see what, if anything, domestic Belgium has been trying to wrestle with?
Yeah, well, it's the Belgian situation is one has to explain that, I guess. There's two aspects I want to mention regarding Belgium in that case. In this context, is on the one hand, there is a large debate. There is a public debate. There's a academic debate also. There are many people busy with this topic. And I mean, there's some other books, some recent books that are revealing that and are dealing with this head on, you could say. There's one there's one American actually contributing, another American contributing to that. Also, let me see if I can find the name here. Stannard, Matthew Stannard, maybe some of you know it, I see, from Georgia. And he made a kind of inventory of all the statues that are related to colonialism. So very thorough investigation and putting it on the table, and it's very much discussed. But we also have to realize that obviously the population that is being affected, so to speak, of the statues is not the Belgian population. The Belgian population got a lot of projects got a lot of money from the colony. Unfortunately, in other words, these statues don't have the same connotation because they kind of represent wealth, Belgian national identity, if you like. And the amount of Congolese diaspora in Belgium is very relatively small. So the people who are mainly discussing these statues are, on the one hand, African diaspora. In Belgium, there's about 50,000 people living, so a very small number. And on the other hand, academics and the scholarly community, if you like. And also awkwardly, also some nationalist parties, but then are obviously against the statues for almost, you could say, different reasons. So it's a complicated issue. I have to say that it's slowly kind of moving in the right direction, in my opinion. So there will be, I think, some removals also. That answers your question.
See if we have other questions from the audience. We have one from Zoom, Ray. Can you please?
It's actually from me.
From you, that's fine. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, we did actually get one from you, so I will prioritize that one. Apologies. Yes, this is a question from B. Pluis. I do apologize if I mispronounced your name. They thank you for a fascinating lecture and said they have a question regarding the final part of your lecture when you discuss the architectural strategies. How do you think that we could improve and align architectural education with that very sophisticated role of architects in mind?
It's obviously a very good question coming from a colleague of mine. I would like to think, of course, that we're already doing that in the small town of Hasselt, but maybe that's presumptuous of me. It is something, I think, in architectural education, which has to be addressed on different levels. And maybe that's the difficulty, because it's very easy somehow to talk about this on a theoretical level, like I'm giving a lecture here. But actually, to make it fully understand, I think students have to put it in practice. That's why I'm also showing student projects. It is to actively engage with sites, with each other, to transform them. So I really think they should be part of design education, to create an awareness in the daily practice of design, rather than reading books, and which is also, of course, very important. But you kind of tend to forget what you read. While when it's in your hands, you keep on practicing it, if you like.
Ray, why don't we go to your question?
Yes, so my question, after you gave that lovely response about the importance of sort of practical skills, I have a very theoretical question. So one of the things that struck me about the topic in general and then your presentation is it reminds me a lot of particularly Marcuse's repressive tolerance. Mm-hmm. And in that piece, to sort of grossly oversimplify, he sort of talks about how there's different spheres where tolerance is allowed and understandable, the academic sphere, for instance, and then spheres where it can actually be harmful, right? You know, tolerance of racism and colonialism in a social context, for instance. And what I'm interested by is a lot of these sites, and especially as you're talking about adaptive reuse, they seem to blur the line between those things, right? Something like a museum is a public building, but it also can be an educational site. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, again, a good question. And of course, I tried to address it a bit with humor, if you like, by calling it Museum B, Option B, Museum B. But it's not funny. There are definitely parts that are not funny about it. Indeed, museums are tools that not always represent, are not always in good hands, let's say. And I would even go further, even an academic context can actually also be oppressive, as we heard a list of names here on the site that are, let's say, problematic. But at the same time, I do think we have to, it's actually a sign of humanizing also, I guess. And that's why I'm also showed, for instance, this Howard, the sculptor. There's a gray zone. We have to accept that. None of us is free of guilt in those terms. So I think we do have to somehow find the way of dealing with it in a human way without turning it into a witch hunt. And it's our everyday environment, actually, that we have to deal with. It's not so much just one or the other. It's not just museums and not just monuments. It's all over the place. I have to say, when I being visiting scholar here, I almost from day one, I'm being confronted with issues that relate to this also. I mean, you just kind of see the racial profiling that happens here, or I mean, kind of, it's part of everyday life, unfortunately. I'm not sure if it gives an answer to your question.
Yes, I appreciate it.
It is 1 o'clock, so we will have to conclude today's presentation. So let me first thank all of you for attending the presentation, the people here in the room, the people on Zoom, also those who follow this on live stream on the YouTube channel. Thank you also to Ray Savard for helping us behind the scenes, setting up the event. But of course, the biggest thank you goes to Nikolaas Vande Keere for an excellent presentation, also for the way you handled the Q&A. It's really good, very interesting. We learned a lot. Hope you will join us for a future event here at the Institute of European